Roy Bookbinder, he was a fingerstyle guitar player, like the blues, but not not Delta blues. It's more like they would call it Piedmont or style of people like Pink Anderson and Reverend Gary Davis. And he traveled with Reverend Gary Davis and, traveled with him, opened for him, was his handler, learned from Reverend Gary Davis. So Roy, who just passed away, is the link. He's that link between one of the last links between the direct to the people who like Pink Anderson and Gary Davis and all of this, then him, and then passing it on generationally. And so his fingerstyle and his storytelling, and he's very well known to people in that world. And I've always kept up with him. I mean, we did 2 albums together. The first when I was 18, the second when I was 19. I did those 2 albums. It was touring before I was 20. And he opened up a world. Like one of the very first, very early shows, first couple of shows, I think, that I did with him was we opened up for Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee at Max's Kansas City. And I mean, I had never done, and I was 17 or maybe 18 at that point, but not any older than that. I was probably 17. But we opened up for them, and we were waiting for there's got to be a review in the New York Times, or so. Who was it? John Rockwell, or I think it was Rockwell. But anyway, we knew he was there. So anyway, but there was nothing. There was nothing. So we're going, oh well. And then the Sunday Times come out, and I still have the original, and about the show and how great it was, And I think the headline was Terry and McGee compliment Bookbinder and Kaplin at Max's Kansas City, And we thought, this is it. We're gonna hit the big time. and nothing really happened. We went back to doing our, playing college coffee houses and stuff like that, which was fine. But I learned, that was my early days of traveling with Roy. I grew up in New York City, in Manhattan. In my early teens, I became very enamored of the folk music scene of New York City. Going to the Lincoln Center Library, which I lived on the Upper West Side, so I could even walk down to the Lincoln Center Library, but realized that there was all of this, of course, there's no computer, no nothing, So I suddenly realized, there's all of these reissues that started coming out on County, of reissues of 78s, the original 78s. So I started taking those out, and teaching myself to play, whatever I was, 12, 13, 14. That there was a show that Pete Seeger had on public television called Rainbow Quest. And so I would always watch Rainbow Quest to see Pete Seeger play banjo. And he would have on different guests. He would have on, Odetta or Reverend Gary Davis or whoever. The New Lost City Ramblers came on, which was Mike Seeger, who is Pete Seeger's half-brother, Tracy Schwartz and John Cohen. And they were young men at that time. And I always say that, they had... They wore white shirts with sleeve garters, and they were playing old-time string band music, not bluegrass music, but trad string band music. And I saw those guys, and I always say, somebody sees the Rolling Stones or AC/DC or whatever it is and goes that's it, that's it. I saw those guys and went, that's it. That's what I want to do. I really did. And found their albums, and then kind of going backwards, founding, they're playing 78, because they played everything exactly like the 78. Then I listened to the original 78s. So I was very enamored with that, and started as a teenager going, I've been to a festival or two, Smithsonian Festival, Fox Hollow Festival, but it's all word of mouth and stuff like that. So there was a small festival in New Jersey. I had friends that lived in New Jersey. So I'd take the bus and the train over to New Jersey for this festival, which is a small festival in New Jersey. And Roy Bookbinder was playing it. And I remember of everybody there, it was like he was the only person really that I stopped and I saw his whole set. And I was 17. So afterward, there was an after party at someone's house. We had a big house. So I went to it, and in one of the rooms was Roy sitting playing to a group of people, like sitting around. He's playing. And so I stopped and was like that. And Roy looks up and he goes, "Hey, Fats, you want to play a tune?" So I'm going like, sure. Now, how did he know I was Fats? Because I had a fiddle case that I had hand decorated with this it was from an old Civil War, like a eagle with shields, and I painted it on the side of the fiddle case, and then I put my name, Fats Kaplin, just for such occasions. He said, we played a couple tunes together. And he said, yeah, maybe you get together. He lived in Greenwich Village, and I lived in the Upper West Side. So I went down to his place, played some, and we started talking about maybe going, do some shows together. And that's how so I went out on the road with Roy Bookbinder at the age of 17. And Roy taught me how to drive in the East Village in a Volvo 544 with a stick shift, which is what the car he had. So, and learned how to park and everything, because first he goes, "Well, do you know how to drive?" And I go, "No." He goes, "Well, we got to split the driving. So here, I'll show you how to drive." So taught me how to drive. And the first time I ever went, I had never been south in my life. And the first time I went south was with Roy Bookbinder to meet Pink Anderson in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Yeah. And it was like, I'd never seen anything like, just the whole, the rough side of town, and Pink there, and they brought Pink up and opened some shows for him, and those are about like the first things I did with Roy Bookbinder. Yeah.
Well, what was the typical gig like?
Like Philly Folk Festival, some festivals, some smaller ones. Then a lot of there was college coffee houses or folk clubs, like there was like the Town Crier, Charlotte's Web, all these early folk clubs. Probably make a couple $100. We'd travel. At that point, we're traveling in a van and in a car. In the early days, actually the 544. You just stay at a cheap motel or stay at somebody's house. It was all very exciting to me. I was playing in bars and when I was underage. And that's all I wanted to do. And for better or worse, it's all I've done my whole life. But was to be basically sort of like a traveling itinerant fiddle player. Like that was my goal. Not such as it was. I dropped out of school way super early, and just when I legally shouldn't have been, but I just hit the road.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, and somehow I've done it. Pretty much my whole life, Yeah, but it was an interesting time.
Did he talk about Reverend Gary Davis much?
Oh, he'd tell stories about traveling with him back in the earlier days before he met me, which was the early 1970s. So back into the 60s, just sort of what a character was traveling with him. Just old blind reverend who's traveling and had to make sure everything was, that he knew where everything was. And, but stylistically, very influential to him.
His guitar playing, Reverend Gary Davis, for anybody who's never tried to learn Cincinnati flow rag.
Yeah.
You hear it, and that's interesting. And then you start trying to break down what's happening, and it's impossible to someone like myself. Mm-hmm. And you realize how advanced that stuff really was.
Yeah, that type of playing, and also Pink Anderson, a similar type of fingerstyle playing, and particularly because Pink Anderson, it was the last years of his life, and he was still really good. He was really good. But he made only a couple of recordings with Pink Anderson and Simi Dooley, and in the was it late 20s, early 30s, but that where you can hear both those guys playing, and they're just like, snapping it, that kind of stylistically, very, very, really interesting. And for those who don't know, but of course, the Pink Floyd, right? The Pink in Pink Floyd is Pink Anderson. I was completely immersed in to the horror of my parents, I come from a family of bohemian artists, interesting family, but I mean, and in a way, how would you rebel against growing up in Manhattan and growing up in the Museum of Modern Art and going to peace marches and stuff like that? I know what I'll just start playing fiddle and banjo, wearing bib overalls, reading Mark Twain. And this is what I was doing. And I'm trying to teach myself to play the fiddle by listening to 78s. My poor parents. Okay. Yeah, I mean, Roy would come through, and particularly the last years, he had a small, like, compact motorhome, and he would come and park it behind our house, like in between gigs, like for a couple days. And, he'd come in and have dinner with us and hang out, but he'd just stay in his motorhome. And on one of those, it was the day, I believe this is correct, the day before his birthday, we had a show at the 5 Spot. We set up a show, a birthday celebration for Roy. And Roy and I played, and he had guests, and it was great. And it was for Roy's 80th birthday.
Did you feel like he was appreciated?
Yeah. He said I remember he saying, that was the best birthday I've ever had. Well, it was a lot of fun. When he started listening and sort of teaching himself to play guitar and stylistically that way because of the Gary Davis and others, and he went to the UK, and he had an album out on Arculi, was that it? But this is a long, long time ago, and he's a very, it's an interesting life. I mean, he just he did this, and he started traveling and playing, and basically he never stopped. He never stopped he'd do his circuit with the like he eventually wound up in Florida long, long ago, and in St. Petersburg, and he would go out on the circuit, playing, and then in the fall, and he said, and then I would come back in winter in Florida. He goes, just like the circus, and he goes, except I've outlasted the circus. Yeah, that's when Ringer Brothers said stopped, but yeah, that's what he would do.